pleased to present Austin Faith Dialogue, brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries. In the weeks ahead, you will see these and other programs by various denominations. Austin Faith Dialogue, a public affairs program at the crossroads of religion and life, a series highlighting the cultural and social interaction between the worshiping and religious communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KTVC. Join us now in Austin Faith Dialogue.
At the heart of this capital city of the state of Texas is the Capitol building itself. And at the heart of the governmental process are not only the representatives and senators who comprise the two houses of the legislature, but there are those who lobby for the enactment of laws pertaining to the heart. Hello, I'm Richard Thompson, pastor of Central Presbyterian Church, and your host for this edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. And today we turn our attention to that special advocate for human services, Texas Impact, an interfaith organization that would put heart into our elected officials. This is true both in terms of courage to make decisions that are difficult and also to have a heart for those who are caught in desperate circumstances. We're privileged today to have Sue Thornton, who's the executive director of Texas Impact, and from the halls of the legislature itself, Representative Jack Vowell from El Paso. And we welcome both of you.
Glad to be here.
And I'd like to start, Sue, by having you tell us something about Impact, because I have a hunch that a good number of our folks in the churches and the synagogues in the Austin area that maybe even support Impact through their denominations still haven't heard a great deal about it. Mm-hmm. So can you tell us what it is?
Well, Texas Impact is an interfaith network that is made up of some 34 different regional church bodies, which are called judicatories, as well as several hundred individuals around the state that are part of our network, and the major metropolitan ministries in the state as well. And our primary goal is to work through the political process to affect the lives of the needy in the state.
Mm-hmm. And you've been doing this for how long?
The organization of Texas Impact has been around for about 15 years.
I see. And you just recently come on board as the director, I understand.
Correct. I began last summer.
Mm-hmm. Representative Val, you've had contact with Impact over the time that you've been in the legislature, I understand. How long has that been?
It's been 10 years, going on 11. And I've been with them every year. I've been in the legislature.
Uh-huh. And why did you connect yourself with this particular organization?
Well, they connected themselves with me.
Okay. They came looking for you.
In the early years of my experience in the legislature, after I got involved with human services, they came and talked to me about programs and budgets. Mm-hmm. So I became very familiar with the groups and also the individuals involved, and I still work with them. We share many common goals, many common values, and we generally agree.
Do you think it's an accurate description, Sue, to say that in the heart of Texas, deep in the heart of Texas here in Austin, that your organization is dedicated to putting heart into the process in ways that I was suggesting there, to encourage the legislatures to take some stands that might be kind of tough to take, and to think about the folks that are having particular problems?
Yes, it's been said that Texas Impact has provided the consciousness for the legislature for a number of years now. In the past, I think we have tended to try and take the high road on some issues that are very difficult to deal with.
Can you give us some examples of that?
Well, in the most recent past, it's been funding for human services. And through the last special session last summer, Texas Impact, in conjunction with some other organizations who are similar advocates to the way Texas Impact works, was very instrumental in working to try and get some of the emergency appropriations that were needed.
I see. Well, we talked about the human services before, and I understand you're the chair of the committee that oversees that end of the legislative process.
Just the budget and the oversight for programs. I'm not chairman of the Human Services Committee,
I see. A particular
but
part
of the budget portion.
Now, you were on our show 2 years ago, and I'd like to do just a little comparison, if we could, of are things better, worse, about the same as far as the human services sector of our
I think
life?
the human services sector is, in terms of the variety of programs we offer, better off. In terms of the funding level necessary to carry forward those programs, we are worse off. For example, 10 years ago, if you were in need, there were 2 programs that you could access, food
Okay.
stamps and AFDC.
All right.
Now you have 8 programs. And to administer those programs and to fund them has placed a major burden on the legislature.
So you've got 8 programs total, or in addition
Oh,
to
no,
those?
those are just, let's say if you were poor, you have a whole spectrum of programs for which you may be qualified. And the department must administer all of those programs, and each one is funded differently, with the result that as more people get into the mainstream, then you have to have more money.
Okay, well, you know, the thing that you read in the papers all the time is that, well, the state is strapped for money again. That it seems to me somewhere in the neighborhood of $4.6 billion, $5 billion range, that anticipated deficit in this 1991 year. And this is despite the fact that since you were last on the show, that there have been tax increases of rather substantial size. So how do you reconcile the fact? Sue, I mean, you've been tracking this. How can you explain this, that there's been more money made available and yet there's more deficit?
Well, I think that there are a number of factors that have come into play. The state, I guess it was 2 years ago, Mr. Val, changed some of their forms that allowed people to apply for services, which resulted in approximately a 40% increase in caseloads within the Department of Human Services. Then also, some federal mandates came down in the spring of last year to the state that changed some eligibility requirements within some programs and brought some more folks onto the possibly onto the rosters than had been there in the past. So we've had some increases in things that really were not totally within our control.
Okay. Does that summarize it, or is there more to it?
I think that is basically what has happened. You have to consider that our population continues to grow. The number of elderly people continue to grow. We have a broader spectrum of programs, and we have a more accessible program menu, which means that we're getting a lot more people than we anticipated into our services, and we're having to fund them. The major deficits that we have faced in the past 2 years have been in the area of health and human services, in the Department of Mental Health and Mental Retardation, in the Department of Human Services. And we are today facing, in this fiscal year, a deficit of around $324 million, most of which is related to the Department of Human Services. It simply means that 2 years ago, we vastly underestimated the number of people who would access the programs that we have. And that, it says a lot about the conditions in our society today.
So you've had more people come in part because you've made more programs available to a wider spectrum of the society. You've got a growing population, not younger and older both, as far as the needs are concerned. And I guess the other thing that I'm wondering about is whether, you mentioned the federal government's laying on us some programs that they don't then fund and leave it up to the states to fund. At the same time, hasn't it been the case that in the 1980s, the amount of money that was coming from the federal level has decreased enough that the states have had even more to pick up?
Well, in pure dollar terms, we've had more money come into Texas year by year, but as a proportion, we've lost a little money. The federal government in most of the human services programs pays around 60% of the cost, and the state of Texas pays about 40% of the cost.
Right.
Now, when I got in the legislature, it was more like 50-50. What happened, though, is that these formulas are based upon economic conditions, and as you know, Texas has had a worsening of economic conditions, so the proportion of federal dollars has increased accordingly. But more important than that, the mandates have had such tremendous impact over a wide range that we don't have the financial resources really to deal with them in the way that we wanted to. 10 years ago, we were able, through state initiatives, to more or less control the ceiling. Today, the federal government has raised that ceiling so vastly that, as I have said many times, we're going to take care of around 25% of the children from birth to age 18 in the Medicaid program, whereas 10 years ago we took care of maybe 8%.
Okay. So as you hear these statistics, I don't know if you have this feeling, Sue. I sometimes look at it from the standpoint of John Q. Public, that reads the kind of thing that you're just talking about, just the overwhelming sense of need, kind of an ocean waves that keep hitting us in ever larger sizes. Do you run into the feeling in the churches and religious places of worship that you visit that it's just almost too much for us to cope with, and kind of a sense of hopelessness about this? Or are you a conveyor of hope?
Well, I certainly hope so. I think certainly that the figures are very overwhelming, and to have these numbers thrown at a person, you know, all at once is pretty doggone overwhelming. But I think that people really do realize that we have some responsibility as citizens to take care of those folks who are our brothers and sisters who need some help, but do it in a way that does not perpetuate a cycle where they would where they would stay on the welfare rolls for years and years.
So how do you avoid that vicious cycle of dependency? What's your revelation in that regard?
Well, I'm not sure I have major revelations in that regard, but I think that a lot of it has to do with the way that the programs are structured, and some case management that could happen where particularly some of these children that Mr. Val mentioned a minute ago could have some real targeted services early on, and hopefully get them through what would be a crisis period in their lives, in a way that maybe would cause them to not have to stay on those roles for a number of years.
Is that a realistic hope that you could avert that kind of dependency in that way?
I don't feel that that is the answer. Again, going back 10 years, we could say that the average aid for dependent children recipient, that is, mother with children, unmarried, who was on welfare, was on welfare about 4.6 years. Today, every child from birth to 18 whose family is not making $14,000 a year for a family of 4 is going to be on welfare. And so you can't just have case management and get them off welfare. What you're going to have to do is raise the economic level of family income to get them off welfare.
Okay, which is beyond the scope of your committee to handle.
Well, I don't think so. I think that what we've got to do is look realistically at our society and see what the risk factors are that encourage and increase dependency. And go beyond the idea that we're simply going to have a welfare program and a Medicaid program and a battered women's program and a child abuse program, and understand that these are merely symptoms of some underlying problems, and we ought to attack the underlying problems. A good example of this is teenage pregnancy. Teenage pregnancy is bad, in my opinion, for a number of reasons. It's unhealthy for the mother. The children are placed at much greater risk. They are more likely to be on poverty. It's difficult for the mother to get an education. And if we could simply reduce significantly the number of girls who are unmarried teenagers who have babies, we could reduce the risk of a large portion of our society. 15% of all live births in the state last year were to teenage mothers who were unmarried. The welfare cost for that group alone is $21 million this year.
Okay. So what's your response to his thought that if I go back to what you're saying, like all boats rise when the economy is stronger, do you feel that's an adequate approach?
Well, certainly I agree with Mr. Val that I think that some of these programs or the need for some of these programs are just the tip of the iceberg for what the problems are within our society today. I think that, you know, the world has just gotten to the point where families are having a much more difficult time. Most of the there's usually needs to be 2 breadwinners within each family in order to maintain a sufficient economic level when there are 2 parents within one home. There's just lots of family breakdown there that is, I guess, used to be the fabric of our system in this country that is becoming unraveled and is just not there in the same way that it was in past years or in past times.
So it seems to me, just to listen to what you've said, is that, you know, you started saying that the caseworkers who can help more skillfully to move people away from dependency and not just administer the dole sort of thing. And you're saying that the economic underpinnings and the structure needs to be going up rather than worsening so as to help people have less need to resort to these kinds of programs. But the last thing that you said about the strengthening the family structure and to get into the sort of the heart of what's happening in this sort of this moral crisis of our society today. I guess this is where, in terms of this being an Austin Faith Dialogue show, it would be a little different than if it was just a secular analysis of the situation. It's somehow to get at the heart of that. Goes beyond the mandate of what Texas Impact can do. You're trying to make sure that there's adequate funding for the human services, and as a state legislator, you're trying to respond to the various pressures that come to bear, but somehow this seems to go beyond the legalities, beyond the legislature per se, to what's going on out there in the society.
Oh, I agree with you 100%. We are a society in crisis, and we need to do something about it. And all the money in the world and all the caseworkers in the world and all the efficiency in the world is not going to solve this problem. What we have to do is change the way people look at their role and understand that the government cannot be the solution. We have to have a partnership of the entire community. We have to realize that you need to have some kind of family or surrogate family that works. Otherwise, you're in big trouble. And we need to develop a consensus again about certain moral values which seem to have been forgotten in the past 20 years.
Well, that's obviously a need and a topic beyond our limited time here today, but I think it's important to focus on that broader issue. And I do want to focus on one or two more specific issues in regard to the legislature while we're together. And one has to do with what up until recently has been considered, I think, heresy to say in public, and that's the word income tax. That in Texas and Connecticut are one of the few of the big states that have held out against that. And one of the things that I've wondered about is whether, in light of the crunch that's coming not only with the human services, but you mentioned MHMR and Department of Human Services, and you've got the prisons, and you have the school needs that are, of course, very much on our consciousness. Is there any alternative, really, to, in terms of financing of this, what are we, the third largest state now? Without some recourse to a more consistent and a more broadly based tax structure. And I think our program would be incomplete in 1991 without addressing that.
I feel, and have been on record for some time, as saying that we need to broaden our tax and revenue base. To me, at least, the only sensible way to do this is to have an income tax. People have an ideological feeling about income tax. An income tax is merely an instrument for getting revenue, and people ought to judge its efficacy by what impact it has. If you look at your property tax, your sales tax, your other fees, and your other taxes, you pass judgment on them on the basis of what they do. Not what they are, but what they do.
Okay,
and income tax ought to be judged on the same basis.
Well, let's judge it on that basis compared to these others. Because I get the feeling that we've kind of jerry-built a whole system of tax alternatives that seems to be crumbling under this weight of need.
We have, and we've tried to avoid an income tax because no one will stand up and say, consider an income tax as a viable alternative. They all say, we won't have an income tax. I hate income tax, or something of that sort. An income tax is a tax, for one thing, which you pay when times are good and which you don't pay when times are bad for you personally.
And when you replace that with, I mean, you'd be doing some reductions otherwise. I mean, you wouldn't keep other taxes at the same
That's
level.
right. You reduce the sales tax. You probably get rid of the franchise tax. You probably get rid of the property tax for school purposes. And what you do, in effect, is place the burden upon those who can afford it the most. And those are the people who own and have the biggest stake in our society, and proportionately today they're paying less than any other group in our society.
You, as the Director of Impact, can you say whether there has been a position taken by that organization in regard to the income tax?
Well, while we have not taken an official position by our board, certainly we have been looking at this as an option for the last couple of years. As we mentioned before, I think Texas has sort of ridden the horse about as far as it will go, and it's time to quit band-aiding the system and to go in and make a real meaningful reform there.
Yeah, I noticed that the governor in Connecticut, Lowell Weicker, has led that state in that direction with the same, the sales tax goes up so high and the property tax goes up so high that finally there's a shift in the feeling about that. Now, whether that will happen here, we'll just have to wait and see, but it seems to me that that seems to be a direction that we may be going.
I think that in the next year to 2 years, we will have an income tax in this state.
Within the next year or 2 years, are you going to be in the legislature?
I can't tell you that.
Okay. I mean, you haven't made a decision about whether to continue.
Well, I'm here. I was elected for 2 years, so a year after next, which would be the second year that you're talking about, I might not be reelected.
But let's say you, just from the standpoint of what I saw that Lieutenant Governor Bullock had to take a job in a counseling center in order to supplement his income to stay in office. And it seems to me that here, again, the third largest state, and we're paying people just a pittance, relatively speaking, to perform these vast, complex services. Am I misreading the injustice of that?
Well, I don't think it's so much an injustice as an unrealistic approach. In a real sense, you get what you pay for, and we spent 14 months out of the previous 24 months here in Austin. It cost me more to eat every week than I get paid to my per diem.
How much do you get paid?
$30 a day.
I see.
And if you don't have an independent income, you're simply not going to be able to perform your functions as a legislator. And so everybody in the legislature either has to have an independent income or a partner someplace who's going to provide him with an income, or he can't make it.
He or she can.
Yeah.
And the fact is that it seems to me that in terms of the ethics, that is so much an issue that the pressure and the temptation to sell out would be really great if you got in financial straits. This certainly wouldn't be the only reason for that, but it would be one of the factors that would enter into it.
I don't think you sell out. I think what happens is people know that you need something and they offer it to you.
I see.
And they build up a set of obligations. Very few people that I know of have been paid to vote a certain way. But there's no doubt about it that you build up a sense of obligation if you accept large gifts. And I think this is at the heart of this. And some people have received very large gifts and very great privileges, and this has antagonized the public.
It would be our obligation, Sue, to let the viewing public know the phone number of Texas Impact.
Surely.
And could you share that with us?
Excuse me. It's
I'm sorry your phone number chokes you up like that.
It's 472-3903.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you were able to get that out. And I know you've been fighting a cold here, and we appreciate your coming on board with us nevertheless. You've been very helpful in your sharing of this insight, and welcome back again, Representative Ballard.
It's a pleasure always to come back.
Always glad to have you here, and it's good to have you folks look in today on our latest look at Texas Impact and what's happening on the state level with the legislature. And I hope this goes to your heart as you reflect upon it. And we'll look forward to seeing you again next week at Austin Faith Dialogue. I'm Richard Thompson, thanking you for watching. And peace be with you. For more information, call Austin Metropolitan Ministries at 472-76